Before sunrise on October 27, 1942, in the choppy waters of the South Pacific, roughly 420 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, Commander Edward P. Parker stood along the weathered rail of the USS Northampton, watching a sight he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The USS Hornet, mortally damaged and aflame, was sliding beneath the surface. Her ruptured fuel tanks sent pillars of fire across the waves, spreading a harsh glow that turned the surrounding ocean into a vast, shimmering field of reflected destruction. As the carrier disappeared, she took around 140 sailors with her, along with the last fully operational American fleet carrier in the region. Parker later recorded in his private journal a line that could have cost him his career had it reached the wrong hands. 4 fleet carriers gone in less than a year. At this pace, by Christmas, our Navy may have nothing left afloat. The note, stark and unvarnished, captured the psychological weight of what he had just witnessed. The loss of Hornet marked the 4th American fleet carrier destroyed in 1942. The sequence had been relentless. USS Lexington lost to the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8. USS Yorktown sunk after the fighting at Midway on June 7. USS Wasp torpedoed near Guadalcanal on September 15. And now Hornet, crippled by bombs and torpedoes at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Taken together, these losses represented a collapse of American carrier strength that few in Washington had believed possible. U.S. intelligence had underestimated the Japanese Navy, portraying it as a force reliant on imitation rather than innovation. Yet the Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated not only tactical skill, but also a capacity for decisive strikes that left more than half of America's pre-war Pacific carrier force on the ocean floor. Meanwhile, far across the world in Newport News, Virginia, a very different scene was unfolding. In a cavernous shipyard glowing with sparks and molten metal, a welder named Margaret Thompson was preparing to begin another night shift, one of thousands of workers whose efforts would eventually overturn the bleak outlook that officers like Parker faced at sea. Neither she nor Parker could know that the despair of late 1942 represented not the beginning of defeat, but the turning point before an unparalleled surge in American maritime production. What followed, quietly at first, then with accelerating momentum, was a transformation that would redefine the Pacific War. Contrary to later myths, the shift did not hinge on sudden tactical genius or some revolutionary new naval technology. Instead, it grew out of the complete mobilization of American industrial society. Skilled laborers were joined by housewives who learned to weld, by farmhands who trained as shipfitters, and by thousands of newly recruited workers who filled factories that operated around the clock. America became, in effect, the vast industrial machine that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had long warned his government about, a nation capable of generating military power on a scale no adversary could match once fully engaged. The consequences were staggering. Between late 1942 and the end of the war, U.S. shipyards launched dozens of aircraft carriers, including 14 Essex-class fleet carriers that entered combat, a number exceeding Japan's total wartime production of comparable vessels. The shift in naval balance was so dramatic that Japanese officers later described their struggle against American forces as fighting the stars, a metaphor for an enemy whose numbers seemed to multiply beyond reason. For every carrier Japan crippled or sank, more appeared on the horizon. Thus, what seemed in 1942 like the collapse of American naval aviation became, within 3 years, one of the most extraordinary industrial recoveries in military history. The road from Hornet's burning wreckage to overwhelming Allied naval supremacy was built not only on courage at sea, but on welding torches, assembly lines, and a nationwide mobilization that turned a democracy into an engine of maritime power with effectively inexhaustible capacity. The sequence of American carrier losses in 1942 began in early May, far from the continental United States, in the turbulent waters of the Coral Sea. On May 8th, USS Lexington, one of only 2 large U.S. carriers built on converted battlecruiser hulls before the war, absorbed a series of devastating hits delivered by Japanese naval aviators. 2 torpedoes slammed into her side, and 3 aerial bombs pierced her deck. For a brief period, it seemed the crew's determined damage control teams had contained the disaster. But leaking aviation fuel spread volatile fumes through the ship's interior spaces. When these ignited, a chain of catastrophic explosions followed. The Lady Lex ultimately sank along with 216 members of her crew, marking the United States' first loss of a fleet carrier in the Pacific War. Her captain, Frederick Sherman, later summarized the grim arithmetic to Congress. At the outset of hostilities, the U.S. Navy possessed only 7 fleet carriers in the Pacific theater. Japan entered the war with 10. Every senior officer understood what that imbalance meant. The United States could not afford to trade ships at a one-for-one rate, let alone lose them more quickly than they could be replaced. Barely a month after Lexington's destruction, another major carrier disappeared from the American order of battle. On June 7, 1942, the battered USS Yorktown, which repair crews at Pearl Harbor had miraculously restored to fighting shape in just 2 days after the Coral Sea action, was struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-168. Yorktown had played a decisive role in the triumph at Midway, an operation that cost Japan 4 carriers and decisively shifted the strategic initiative. Yet even in victory, the U.S. Navy paid a grievous price with the loss of one of its most valuable ships. September brought no relief. On the 15th, while operating in support of the struggle for Guadalcanal, the carrier USS Wasp was hit by 3 torpedoes fired by the submarine I-119. Fires raged uncontrollably across her decks for hours. When it became clear she could not be saved, the destroyer Lansdowne delivered the final blows, scuttling the ruined ship. By this point, 3 of the 7 carriers available in the Pacific at the war's outset were gone.
The situation worsened still further in late October. During the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, October 26 to 27, 1942, the carrier USS Hornet, the ship that had launched the Doolittle raid and had participated in Midway, came under sustained assault by Japanese dive bombers and torpedo aircraft. Despite strenuous attempts to keep her afloat and an effort to tow her clear of the battlefield, advancing Japanese surface forces forced U.S. commanders to abandon the ship. Enemy destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo subsequently delivered the torpedoes that sent Hornet to the bottom. When news of these losses reached Washington, Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, faced Congress with stark, almost hopeless numbers. At this moment, he informed them, the Pacific Fleet has a single operational fleet carrier, Enterprise. Japan still has 10. To many observers, the implication was unmistakable. The United States appeared to be losing the war at sea before its industrial strength could take effect. Yet a transformation was already beginning, one King could not yet see. Behind the front lines, a massive national mobilization was gathering momentum. By 1944, 1.7 million new workers, many of them women, would enter American shipyards. Industrialist Henry Kaiser was preparing to overhaul shipbuilding methods so radically that his yards would slash Liberty ship construction time from several months to just over 4 days. And while only a single U.S. fleet carrier had slid down the ways in 1941, American shipbuilding capacity was on the verge of a historic expansion. The shift began not in an admiral's office, but in the administrative rooms of Newport News Shipbuilding. On December 8, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yard Supervisor Clay Bedford summoned his foremen to an emergency conference. Dispensing with tradition, he told them, "Everything you thought you knew about building ships is obsolete. We are going to produce carriers the way Ford produces automobiles." That industrial revolution was sparked by an observation from Helen Matthews, a newly hired worker and former seamstress, who offered an insight that would help reimagine the shipyard's entire production workflow and ultimately reshape the American naval war effort. She stood on the edge of the construction bay, watching veteran crews methodically secure steel plates to the sides of a carrier's hull. The workers moved with practiced rhythm, driving thousands of red-hot rivets one after another. Curious, she turned to her supervisor and asked why the ship couldn't be joined with a single unbroken seam, almost like stitching fabric instead of dotting it with metal fasteners. At first, he laughed at the idea, then the humor faded. The suggestion, simple as it sounded, pointed toward a radical shift. Continuous welding rather than millions of rivets promised to slash construction time by as much as 3/4.
But the innovation came with an unexpected side effect. The skills required were far easier to teach. Instead of spending years training highly specialized riveters, yards could prepare new welders in a matter of days. This change fed into a broader industrial surge that swept through American shipyards in the early 1940s. By the summer of 1943, the Essex-class fleet carriers were emerging from the slipways at a tempo that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Take the lead ship of the class, USS Essex. Her keel was laid on April 28, 1941, and by December 31, 1942, she had been commissioned, barely 20 months from the start of construction to full operational status. And that achievement was only the opening act. Across the country, other yards were discovering new ways to compress their schedules. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, shipfitter First Class Giuseppe DiMaggio, a relative of the well-known baseball player, supervised a team that devised a faster method for installing aircraft elevators. Instead of assembling each platform piece by piece inside the hull, they constructed the entire unit onshore and lifted it into place using giant cranes. The result? Roughly 6 weeks saved on every carrier. Techniques pioneered at Henry Kaiser's Richmond yards spread rapidly throughout the naval construction industry. Prefabrication became the new standard. Deck houses, internal compartments, and other major structures were built in specialized workshops where they could be positioned on their sides or even inverted. Working this way allowed welders to make cleaner, stronger joints. Tasks that previously demanded 1,000 workers laboring for a full month could now be completed by 200 workers in 1 week. The cumulative effect of these efficiencies was staggering. The production statistics speak for themselves. USS Yorktown, CV-10, was laid down on December 1, 1941, and commissioned on April 15, 1943. USS Intrepid began construction the same day, December 1, 1941, and entered service on August 16, 1943. USS Hornet, CV-12, was started August 3, 1942, and ready by November 29, 1943. USS Franklin went from keel laying on December 7, 1942, to commissioning on January 31, 1944. Every new launch came quicker than the last. Philip A. Kellogg, a welder working at Bethlehem Steel's Fore River Yard, kept notes in his diary that tracked the accelerating pace. In January 1943, he wrote that they were sending a carrier down the ways roughly 60 days. By June, the interval had fallen to 45 days. When December 1943 arrived, new ships were leaving the yard every 30 days. Kellogg remarked that Japanese observers must assume the Americans had resorted to some kind of sorcery to produce vessels so rapidly. By the spring of 1943, America's wartime shipyards were transformed by an unprecedented influx of civilian labor. What had once been overwhelmingly male industrial spaces now relied heavily on workers who only months earlier would never have imagined themselves on a shipway. Women made up nearly 2/5 of the workforce in Kaiser's massive assembly areas and fabrication shops, taking on roles that demanded strength, precision, and remarkable endurance.
One of the most celebrated figures at Norfolk Naval Shipyard was Emma Rodriguez, a Mexican-American mother raising 3 children who had previously handled nothing more formidable than household tools. Within a short time, she became the yard's most efficient riveter, capable of setting 30 flawless rivets in a single minute. Her performance was held up as proof that the workforce, newly diversified and rapidly trained, could match or surpass traditional expectations. Executive Order 8802, which barred discriminatory hiring in defense production, opened the gates for thousands of African-American laborers who had long been excluded from skilled trades. Among them was James Washington, formerly a sharecropper from Alabama. After retraining at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, he rose to the rank of master pipe fitter. Washington's teams installed critical fuel conduits on 5 aircraft carriers, completing each successive installation in less time than the last. Workers in every yard understood the stakes. Every delay meant more American casualties in the Pacific, where existing carriers were fighting desperately to hold the line. Shipyard walls were plastered with stark images from the front. Photographs of isolated U.S. vessels like the USS Enterprise battling without adequate support. These images served as constant reminders new ships were not merely industrial goals, but lifelines for sailors already in harm's way. "She needs sisters," the captions urged. "Build them now." Efficiency gains came not only from manpower, but from a dramatic rethinking of naval construction methods. At the New York Naval Yard, engineers pioneered a system of modular assembly that revolutionized the timeline of carrier production. Instead of constructing the hull and internal systems sequentially from the keel upward, teams fabricated vast prefabricated sections, complete with piping, electrical circuits, and ventilation, before joining them together on the ways. The approach worked in tandem with strict standardization. Pumps, switchboards, fixtures, and countless other components were manufactured to uniform specifications, allowing parts produced in Detroit to be installed unaltered on ships being assembled in places like Newport News, Brooklyn, or Philadelphia. Under these innovations, some carriers were completed in as little as 14 months, an astonishing pace for vessels of such scale. These industrial advances enabled the rapid emergence of the Essex-class carriers, ships that would come to define American naval dominance during and after the war. Designed not merely to replace losses, they exceeded earlier carriers in every major metric. With the displacement of roughly 27,100 tons, air groups approaching 100 aircraft, and a top speed of about 33 knots, faster even than many destroyers, they represented a new generation of mobile air power. Japanese intelligence took note almost immediately. Commander Masataka Yokomiya, serving on the staff of the combined fleet, recorded in his diary that the United States was commissioning carriers faster than Japan could replenish its pilot corps. Each new American ship, he observed, outmatched Japan's existing designs. The Navy that Japan had struck at Pearl Harbor had been replaced by an industrial juggernaut, one capable of turning out powerful carriers in numbers that dwarfed anything the Imperial Navy could counter.
By the early months of 1944, American shipbuilding capacity had reached a tempo that astonished even the most optimistic planners. Essex-class aircraft carriers, large, fast, and combat-capable, were leaving U.S. slipways at a pace that outstripped the entire carrier output of the rest of the world combined. Observers at the time often referred to this unprecedented industrial surge as the Kaiser Miracle, a nod to the organizational methods that reshaped wartime production. While the traditional naval yards along the east and west coasts concentrated on constructing full-sized fleet carriers, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser transformed the way smaller escort carriers were produced. These compact jeep carriers, vital for convoy defense, submarine hunting, and air support during amphibious operations, were built using principles borrowed from the Liberty Ship program: modular design, simplified assembly, and relentless standardization. At Vancouver, Washington, Kaiser's facility alone turned out 50 escort carriers, setting a new benchmark for rapid naval construction. The lead ship of this class, USS Casablanca, became a case study in speed and efficiency. The vessel progressed from the laying of its keel to official commissioning in under 8 months, a turnaround inconceivable for other nations at the time. For contrast, Japan's escort carrier Shinyo, created by converting an existing passenger liner, required roughly 2 years to complete. The disparity illustrated the widening industrial gulf between the two naval powers. Behind these achievements stood a vast interlocking supply system, an industrial symphony spanning the American continent. Steel mills in Pittsburgh operated around the clock to provide the heavy plating needed for carrier decks. The enormous quantities of aluminum demanded by wartime aircraft were produced in Tennessee, where Alcoa's facilities consumed enough electrical power to rival major metropolitan areas. In Akron, Ohio, the Goodyear plant manufactured the tension cables used in carrier arresting gear. Each cable had to withstand the impact of a 12,000-pound fighter aircraft hitting the deck at roughly 100 miles per hour. Under plant manager William Davis, monthly output rose from 10 units in 1942 to 200 by 1944, a 20-fold leap that mirrored the overall acceleration of U.S. wartime production. Even the most advanced ships, however, were useless without skilled personnel to operate them. Recognizing this, Captain Daniel Gallery proposed an unconventional training solution. Use the calm waters of the Great Lakes as a vast natural aviation school. 2 sidewheel steamers, USS Wolverine and USS Sable, were converted into makeshift carriers and stationed near Chicago's Navy Pier. Despite lacking combat capability, they possessed real flight decks and arresting gear. By 1944, these training vessels were qualifying roughly 500 pilots every month, producing a continuous stream of aviators for the expanding carrier fleet. Across the Pacific, officers within the Imperial Japanese Navy followed these developments with growing alarm. Intelligence summaries reaching Tokyo painted a picture of American construction far beyond Japan's projections. Captain Toshikazu Omi, an operations officer with the combined fleet, would later state that the Japanese High Command assumed the United States might complete 6 or 7 new fleet carriers by 1945. The actual scale of American carrier production, he admitted, lay outside the limits of anything we could imagine.
This imbalance became brutally clear during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japan's remaining carrier strength, confronted a U.S. task force that fielded 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, a force more than double the size of his own group of 6. Reflecting on the battle in later years, Ozawa wrote that the encounter scarcely resembled a contest. Instead, it felt like a preordained execution carried out by an enemy whose resources seemed inexhaustible. By January 1945, American shipyards had reached an industrial cadence that earlier in the war would have seemed fantastical. The Brooklyn Navy Yard managed the simultaneous construction of 3 carriers at once, while Newport News oversaw carrier hulls in varying stages of assembly on 6 separate slipways. The United States had transformed its shipbuilding industry into a vast, coordinated engine. An engine capable not only of sustaining losses, but of expanding naval power on a scale unmatched in modern history. The aircraft carrier USS Lake Champlain became the definitive symbol of wartime industrial acceleration. Launched into service on June 3, 1945, the ship emerged from the slipway a mere 15 months after her keel was laid, an achievement unmatched among American naval vessels built during the conflict. That speed, however, came at a profound human cost. Throughout World War II, U.S. shipyards operated around the clock, and the pressure to deliver hulls at unprecedented tempo created dangerous working conditions. Industrial accidents claimed the lives of more than 3,000 shipyard workers. One such casualty was the husband of Margaret O'Brien, killed when a crane cable failed at the Fore River shipyard.
Within a week, she chose to return to the same yard, stepping into a welding position on the very crew her husband had served with. O'Brien reportedly reminded her co-workers that every delay in construction risked sending another gold star to another family's window. Her resolve embodied both the tragedy and the determination behind the nation's wartime production miracle. By the time the war reached its conclusion, the scale of American naval power stunned even its adversaries. When Japan's surrender delegation traveled to USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, they passed through a vast congregation of U.S. carriers anchored in and around Tokyo Bay. More than 100 fleet, light, and escort carriers, a total surpassing what all other nations combined had ever produced in the entire history of naval aviation, formed an overwhelming display of sea power. Commander Tomichi Yamahara, among Japan's most respected destroyer officers, later remarked with disbelief that although Japan had destroyed 4 American carriers in 1942, the United States had replaced each one 3 times over.
Production record of Essex-class carriers that entered combat. The following Essex-class carriers not only reached commissioning, but also saw wartime action, listed in chronological order of their completion. USS Essex, CV-9, commissioned December 31, 1942. USS Yorktown, CV-10, April 15, 1943. USS Intrepid, CV-11, August 16, 1943. USS Hornet, CV-12, November 29, 1943. USS Franklin, CV-13, January 31, 1944. USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, May 8, 1944. USS Randolph, CV-15, October 9, 1944. USS Lexington, CV-16, February 17, 1943. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, May 24, 1943. USS Wasp, CV-18, November 24, 1943. USS Hancock, CV-19, April 15, 1944. USS Bennington, CV-20, August 6, 1944. USS Bonhomme Richard, CV-31, November 26, 1944. USS Shangri-La, CV-38, September 15, 1944. Additional Essex-class ships were completed before the end of the war, but did not enter combat. USS Boxer, commissioned April 16, 1945. USS Lake Champlain, June 3, 1945. USS Antietam, January 28, 1945. Several further carriers of the class joined the fleet only after the fighting had ceased. These figures also exclude the 9 Independence-class light carriers built on modified cruiser hulls and the more than 100 escort carriers produced over the same period. Technological transformation. The crash mobilization for naval shipbuilding fundamentally reshaped American industrial capability. Wartime innovation introduced modular construction techniques, advanced automatic welding systems, and near-continuous assembly line methods for ship production. These practices, refined under extreme pressure, migrated into the civilian economy after the war. A generation of workers, many of them newly trained women welders and African-American laborers who had previously been barred from skilled trades, left the shipyards with expertise that would power post-war manufacturing. The war demonstrated definitively that these workers could perform at the highest levels of industrial precision when given the opportunity. Strategic consequences.
By 1945, U.S. carrier construction was advancing so rapidly that production had outstripped operational and manpower requirements. Vessels were being completed in less time than it took to train their air groups and ship crews. As Admiral William Halsey explained to Congress in 1946, the Navy had moved from a shortage of carriers early in the war to an excess by its end. No other nation in history had ever produced frontline warships at such speed or in such quantity. The legacy of the workforce. In 1985, 4 decades after victory over Japan Day, Newport News Shipbuilding opened its gates to thousands who had once labored there during the war. More than 5,000 former employees gathered, men and women who had spent their youth shaping steel for the national cause. Among them stood Margaret Thompson, the welder introduced at the beginning of our account. Now 67, she addressed the crowd with a steady voice. They talk about us as if we were extraordinary, but we weren't driven by greatness. We were driven by fury. Our ships had been sunk, our families had been shaken, and our friends had been killed. So we fought back the only way we could, by building vessels faster than the enemy could comprehend. Every spark from our torches carried a message. Remember Pearl Harbor.
An economic and social transformation. The vast wartime construction program did more than reshape naval power. It altered the nation's economic and social landscape. Cities like Richmond, California experienced explosive growth. Its population surged from around 23,000 to roughly 130,000 in just 3 years. The wages paid in the shipyards, exceeding $3 billion, circulated through American communities and played a significant role in the emergence of a more broadly prosperous middle class. At the same time, shipyard work disrupted long-standing social hierarchies. Women proved on a massive scale that they were fully capable of demanding industrial labor. African American workers, often shut out of skilled trades before the war, demonstrated their expertise when given opportunities previously denied to them. Industrial output and naval superiority. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the U.S. Navy controlled a staggering carrier fleet. 14 Essex-class aircraft carriers had already fought in the Pacific, with 3 more completed, but arriving too late to see combat. They were joined by 9 light carriers of the Independence class, 71 escort carriers, and several pre-war carriers still afloat. Japan, by contrast, could field only 6 operational carriers, and many of those lacked pilots who were adequately trained. Britain possessed 19 carriers of various types, but none approached the American output in scale. The contrast underscored the industrial imbalance that ultimately defined the war at sea.
Recognition from a former adversary. In 1962, Rear Admiral Hideo Yano of the newly formed Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force toured the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where many Essex-class carriers had originated. Pausing at the site where USS Yorktown once entered the water, he spoke through an interpreter. "We were aware you were constructing ships," he said, "but we had no conception of the magnitude. It is impossible to contend with a nation able to produce in a single shipyard what our entire empire struggled to build. Our defeat was not solely at sea. It was delivered by your industrial might, by your workforce, and by your relentless capacity to manufacture beyond any logical expectation." The final evaluation. Admiral Chester Nimitz later summarized the matter with characteristic precision. According to him, the conflict's outcome became inevitable as early as 1943, not because of any single engagement, but because of the steady appearance of new American carriers. When we could lose 1 carrier and already have 2 more underway, while Japan had no means of replacing its losses,
The result became a matter of arithmetic. The war's conclusion, in his view, was sealed by production lines rather than battle lines. In the decades since World War II, the extraordinary industrial effort that reshaped American shipbuilding continues to cast a long shadow. Methods first refined between 1942 and 1945, rapid modular construction, disciplined workflow organization, and large-scale coordination between yards remain foundational practices in naval production today. Yet the deeper legacy of that era is not merely technical. It is the enduring proof of what a democratic nation, when fully united, can bring into existence.
Within just 3 years, the United States moved from a moment of acute vulnerability, 4 fleet carriers destroyed, and the possibility of catastrophic defeat looming, to a position of unmatched naval dominance. By the war's midpoint, American shipyards had achieved an output so vast that carrier supremacy in the Pacific became not just likely, but effectively unavoidable. The men and women who labored in those yards demonstrated that the decisive asset of a free society is not solely its armed forces, but its capacity to produce at scale. They showed that a population motivated by shared purpose can generate more ships, more aircraft, and more materiel than any authoritarian rival could hope to match. The transition from 4 sunken carriers to a force including 14 Essex-class carriers in active combat remains the clearest example in history of an industrial mobilization answering a military emergency. Most of the individuals who carried out this feat, people like Margaret Thompson with her welding torch and thousands of others who held riveters, cranes, drafting pencils, and clipboards, are no longer with us. Still, their achievement has outlived them. When the world confronted the threat of fascism and the possible collapse of democratic freedoms, American workers responded with a burst of manufacturing power unprecedented in human conflict. The carriers lost in 1942, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet, did not merely receive one-for-one replacements. They were succeeded by vessels larger in number, superior in engineering, and better suited to the evolving demands of the Pacific War. Each new ship embodied the idea that catastrophe could be met not only with resilience, but with escalation in capability. In the final accounting, Japan was not defeated principally by strategy or tactical brilliance. It was defeated by a society able to outproduce its opponent on every metric that mattered. Those 14 Essex-class carriers that entered combat service are more than historical statistics. They represent how an open society, when pushed to defend its values, can transform industrial potential into a decisive tool of victory. The workers who forged that fleet built something far beyond steel hulls. They constructed the conditions for victory, the preservation of freedom, and the foundations of the post-war world. Today, at Newport News Shipbuilding, the inscription on the memorial recalls the magnitude of their task. It commemorates the moment when ordinary Americans met tyranny not only with courage, but with an outpouring of production so immense that it altered the direction of global history. Their legacy endures in every ship that takes to the water, a reminder that in a democracy, the will of the people can become the most powerful engine.